The crisp morning air was shattered by the sound of gunfire, jolting me awake. Before the aroma of fresh coffee could even reach my nostrils, I was out of bed, my heart pounding in my chest. Another blast echoed across my farm, and I knew immediately that someone was shooting. Not just shooting, but shooting at something on my land. I yanked open the curtains and nearly choked on my own breath. There, standing in the middle of my field, was Margaret Hargrove, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, her perfectly manicured hands gripping a rifle like she was starring in a low-budget action movie. She took aim again, this time at one of my prized goats, and fired. The poor animal let out a pained bleat before collapsing to the ground. I was out the door before my brain could even process what was happening. My boots barely hit the ground as I sprinted toward her, rage bubbling up in my veins. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I shouted, my voice echoing across the field. She turned, looking at me like I was the problem, like I was the intruder on my own farm. "I'm solving a problem," she said, shrugging as she adjusted her ridiculous designer sunglasses. "These filthy animals were trespassing into my yard. I warned you, Tom." I stared at her, speechless for a moment, because surely, she wasn't this insane. "You shot my goats. My actual living goats. With a gun." She rolled her eyes, completely unfazed. "Oh, relax. It's just a few animals. You farmers act like they're more important than people. Maybe if you kept them contained like a responsible adult, I wouldn't have to handle it myself." I opened my mouth, then closed it again, because there were so many things wrong with what she just said that my brain struggled to keep up. This woman had fined a neighbor for leaving their trash cans out 10 minutes too long, yet she thought committing actual animal murder in broad daylight was reasonable. And then it hit me, hard. These weren't just any goats. They were part of a state-funded conservation program, a project spearheaded by Governor Eleanor Whitmore herself. A slow grin crept across my face, something that must have unsettled Margaret because she took a step back. "What?" she demanded, her voice tinged with uncertainty. I folded my arms, suddenly feeling a lot calmer than I had been 5 seconds ago. "Do you know whose goats you just shot?" She scoffed. "Yours, obviously." I chuckled, shaking my head. "Not just mine. These goats belong to Governor Whitmore. You know, the woman who just launched a statewide conservation project to protect this breed. The woman who personally delivered them to my farm for safekeeping." Margaret hesitated, just a flicker of doubt in her expression, but it was there. "You're lying," she snapped, but her voice had lost some of its arrogance. "Am I?" I gestured toward the now lifeless animals. "You just gunned down a species that's under state protection. Do you have any idea what kind of legal trouble that brings?" She paled, but only slightly. "This is ridiculous," she huffed. "I'll pay for the stupid animals. Let's just call it even." I let out a bark of laughter. "Oh no, sweetheart. This isn't a parking ticket. You don't just pay a fine and walk away. The governor personally oversees this project, and trust me, she's not going to be happy when she finds out that some HOA tyrant decided to take matters into her own hands." Margaret's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time since I had known her, she looked unsure. And that was when I knew I had her. The thing about people like Margaret was that they thrived on control. They lived for rules they could twist in their favor, for authority they could wield over others. But this was a storm she couldn't talk her way out of, and she was finally realizing it. She stiffened, lifting her chin in that infuriating way of hers. "I don't have time for this," she muttered, turning on her heel. "I'll deal with this later." I let her walk away because I knew something she didn't. There wouldn't be a later for her. By the time she stepped foot in her pristine, overpriced house, the wheels of her downfall would already be turning. It didn't take long. Less than an hour after the incident, I made a call to the governor's office. I didn't even need to exaggerate the situation. Just relaying the facts was enough to send her assistant into a tailspin. 15 minutes later, Governor Whitmore herself was on the phone, and when I told her what happened, the silence on the other end was almost deafening. She did what? Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, the kind that made my stomach tighten in anticipation. "Shot 3 of them dead," I said, just because she didn't want them near her lawn. There was another long silence. Then, "I'm on my way." I hung up, grinning as I leaned against my porch railing. Margaret had spent years terrorizing this neighborhood with her absurd rules and power trips. She had fined people for their mailboxes being the wrong shade of beige, harassed families for having holiday decorations that weren't pre-approved by the HOA, and made life miserable for anyone who didn't fit her vision of perfection. And now, she had made a mistake she couldn't fix. When the governor arrived, she was livid. She didn't come alone. She brought a small team of legal advisors with her, people who looked far too serious for a simple goat dispute. Margaret must have seen the convoy pull up because she came marching out of her house with her usual self-righteous attitude. But the moment she saw the governor's face, her expression faltered. "Governor Whitmore," she started, pasting on a fake smile. "What a surprise. If this is about the animals, I assure you, it was an unfortunate misunderstanding." The governor didn't even blink. "You killed protected wildlife, Margaret." She let out a nervous laugh. "Well, I mean, technically, you committed a crime." The governor interrupted, her tone sharp enough to slice through Margaret's excuses. "Do you have any idea what you've done? These goats were part of a federally recognized conservation program. They were meant to be a symbol of this state's dedication to environmental restoration, and you shot them with a gun." Margaret's smile was gone now. "It was an accident," she blurted out. "I was just trying to keep them off my property. Surely, we can work something out." The governor stared at her for a long moment, then turned to one of her advisors. "Get legal started on this. I want to know every possible charge we can bring against her." Margaret's eyes widened. "Wait, let's be reasonable here. You lost the right to reason the second you pulled that trigger," the governor said, her voice cold. "You're going to regret this, Margaret. Mark my words." I watched it all unfold with the deepest sense of satisfaction. This was just the beginning. Margaret thought she had power, but she was about to find out just how little control she actually had. The aftermath of the goat massacre unfolded like a slow-moving avalanche, and Margaret was standing directly in its path. It had taken less than an hour for the governor's team to start pulling records, making calls, and preparing the kind of legal paperwork that had the power to flatten lives. Margaret, of course, had no idea just how deep the trouble ran. She still believed she could talk her way out of it. That was her problem. She had spent so much time bullying the neighborhood into submission that she forgot there were people in the world she couldn't control. The first sign of real panic set in when she showed up at the HOA office, demanding that the board issue a formal statement in her defense. It was the kind of move that would have worked in the past. Get the other committee members to stand behind her, make it seem like she was acting on behalf of the neighborhood, paint herself as the poor, misunderstood hero of a story where she had just committed animal homicide. But this time, the room was silent. The board members, many of whom had lived under her tyranny for years, weren't eager to attach their names to her mess. One of them, an older man named Richard, cleared his throat uncomfortably before finally speaking. "Margaret, I don't think we can. Get involved in this. It's kind of a legal matter now." Margaret's eyes flashed with disbelief. "A legal matter? You're seriously telling me you're all just going to sit there and let that farmer and his goats ruin my reputation?" There was a long pause. Then another board member, a woman named Linda, hesitated before saying what everyone else was thinking. "I mean, you did shoot them." Margaret scoffed, waving a hand. "So what? They were on my property. You think any of us would tolerate wild animals just walking into our yards? I did what needed to be done." Richard cleared his throat again, looking increasingly uncomfortable. "Well, technically, they were on Tom's land when you shot them." For the first time, Margaret faltered. The realization that her usual tactics weren't going to work this time flickered across her face. She glanced around the room, expecting anyone, to come to her defense. But no one did, because the truth was, deep down, they were enjoying this. They had all been on the receiving end of her ridiculous fines, her arbitrary rules, her condescending lectures about community standards. Watching her squirm was almost cathartic. She tried a different angle. "Fine. If you all want to abandon me, so be it. But you realize that if I go down, the entire HOA's credibility goes down with me, right? You think the governor's just going to stop at me? She's going to start questioning the entire association, every rule we've ever enforced, every fine we've ever issued. You think any of you are safe?" That one hit a nerve. A few of the board members exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke. Margaret, sensing weakness, pressed on. "This town needs order. Without me, This entire place is going to turn into a disaster. Just imagine what people will start getting away with if I'm not around to keep things in check." Richard sighed, rubbing his temples. "Margaret, I think you need to start worrying about yourself right now. This is bigger than the HOA. It's about the law." That was when Margaret realized she was alone. She stormed out, slamming the door behind her, but the damage was done. Her grip on the HOA was slipping, and she knew it. Her next move was even more desperate. She went straight to the governor's office, demanding a private meeting, convinced that she could intimidate or manipulate her way out of trouble. She had done it before. She had called in favors, twisted words, used her connections to make problems disappear. But when she arrived, she was met with an assistant who barely looked up from her computer screen before saying, "The governor isn't taking any meetings with you, Mrs. Hargrove." Margaret's hands curled into fists. "This is a serious matter. She has to speak with me." The assistant, still typing, didn't even glance at her. "She doesn't actually. But you're welcome to leave a statement. I believe her legal team will be in touch with you soon." Margaret's eye twitched. "This is outrageous. I demand." "Ma'am," the assistant interrupted, her voice completely flat, "I strongly suggest you stop demanding things." For the first time in her life, Margaret was dismissed like she was nothing more than an inconvenience. It wasn't just frustrating, it was terrifying. The power she had built, the influence she had wielded, was evaporating before her eyes, and there wasn't a single thing she could do about it. The news picked up the story within 24 hours. By the next morning, the headline was plastered across every local station. HOA president under fire for killing protected wildlife. The article detailed the incident in full, how she had trespassed onto my farm, how she had illegally shot the goats, how the governor had personally taken action against her. It didn't help that someone had leaked the security footage of her standing in the middle of the field, firing off shots like a suburban commando. The footage was almost comically damning. There she was, in her overpriced athleisure wear, sunglasses perched on top of her head, casually committing a crime in broad daylight. The neighborhood started turning against her. People who had once been too scared to speak up now had the perfect excuse to pile on. Someone printed out copies of the news article and taped them to her front door. Another neighbor placed a stuffed goat on her lawn with a fake crime scene tape wrapped around it. The HOA members, desperate to protect themselves, started digging through old records, looking for ways to distance themselves from her. By the end of the day, it was official. The board had called for an emergency vote to remove her as president. Margaret, still refusing to accept reality, decided that the best course of action was to launch a counterattack. She started calling every lawyer she could think of, looking for someone who would take her case. But the problem was, she had spent so many years making enemies that no one wanted to help her. Every call she made was met with polite refusals. Some didn't even bother with that. One attorney just laughed and hung up. By the time she finally found someone willing to listen, the damage was already done. The governor's legal team had filed an official complaint against her, citing destruction of protected wildlife, reckless endangerment, and unlawful discharge of a firearm on private property. It wasn't just a lawsuit, it was a full-blown criminal case. The fines alone were enough to drain her savings, but the potential jail time, that was what finally made the panic set in. She started unraveling. Her usual perfectly curated composure cracked. She started showing up to HOA meetings uninvited, ranting about conspiracies, claiming that I had set her up, that the governor was out to get her, that this was all some elaborate scheme to destroy her reputation. But no one was listening. They were too busy laughing. The irony was almost poetic. She had spent years punishing people over nonsense, lawn heights, mailbox designs, the shade of paint on a garage door. But now, when she actually needed sympathy, there was none to be found. And the best part? The worst was still yet to come. Margaret's downfall was no longer a slow descent, it was a freefall. She had spent years ruling the HOA like a dictator, convinced that her word was law, that people feared her too much to ever challenge her. But now, she was standing in quicksand, sinking faster with every desperate attempt to pull herself out. The HOA board wasted no time calling for an emergency vote, and it wasn't even close. In a unanimous decision, Margaret was officially removed as president. There was no dramatic speech, no last-minute appeal. She had lost. The people she once controlled now looked at her with something between amusement and relief, as if a great burden had finally been lifted from their shoulders. Her removal should have been the worst of it, but Margaret had unknowingly unleashed something far more dangerous than a neighborhood's resentment: legal trouble that was growing by the hour. The governor had personally ensured that every single violation, every law she had broken, was pursued to the fullest extent. The charges weren't just about the goats anymore. Investigators started digging, and what they found wasn't pretty. There were accusations of harassment, improper fines, even misuse of HOA funds. Every little rule she had enforced on others was now coming back to haunt her. Margaret, of course, refused to take any of it gracefully. She went on the defensive, storming into meetings she wasn't invited to, leaving frantic voicemails for people who had long since stopped taking her seriously. She tried convincing neighbors that this was all a witch hunt, that she was the victim of a conspiracy against her. But the problem was, nobody believed her. Not anymore. The most humiliating moment came when the town held a public forum to address the situation. Margaret had always loved public meetings, using them as a stage to grandstand about community values and property standards. But now, she was the one in the hot seat. The room was packed with people eager to see her squirm. The governor, standing at the front of the room, addressed the crowd with the kind of calm authority that made Margaret's usual theatrics look childish in comparison. "The destruction of protected wildlife is a serious crime," she said, her voice carrying through the hall. "And beyond that, we have received numerous complaints about abuse of power within the HOA. Moving forward, we will be conducting a full audit of all past violations, fees, and regulations enforced under Mrs. Hargrove's leadership." Margaret shot to her feet, her face red with rage. "This is ridiculous. I did what was necessary to maintain order in this community. If I hadn't been enforcing the rules, this whole place would have turned into a disaster." A murmur of laughter rippled through the crowd. One man near the back called out, "Oh yeah, like the time you fined my grandma for having a pink garden gnome." Another woman chimed in, "Or when you tried to evict someone because their Christmas lights weren't taken down fast enough." Margaret's mouth opened and closed, struggling to find a way to spin this. But there was no way out. The governor simply raised an eyebrow and gestured toward the legal team seated beside her. "Mrs. Hargrove, you are free to defend yourself in court. But as of now, your influence over this community is over." The words hit her like a slap. She had spent years bending the town to her will, making people afraid to challenge her authority. Now, she was nothing more than an embarrassment. And worse, the media had turned her into a joke. The local news ran the story for days, replaying the security footage of her shooting at the goats like some unhinged action hero. People online dubbed her Goat Terminator. Memes flooded social media. One particularly popular video edited slow-motion footage of her firing the rifle, set to dramatic music, with the words, "Margaret's Final Stand," flashing across the screen. The HOA wasted no time erasing her influence. The new president, an older retired farmer named Bill, immediately started undoing every ridiculous policy Margaret had ever enforced. Fines were refunded, property restrictions were relaxed, and in an act of poetic justice, Bill announced that in honor of the goats lost to Margaret's rampage, the town would now host an annual goat festival at my farm. The idea spread like wildfire. Vendors signed up, plans were made, and the town embraced it with enthusiasm, turning it into a celebration of everything Margaret had once tried to control. I, of course, found all of this deeply satisfying. I hadn't expected to be at the center of the town's biggest scandal, but watching Margaret's empire crumble was more entertaining than I could have ever imagined. The final nail in her coffin came when she was sentenced to community service, not just anywhere, but specifically on my farm. The judge, in a stroke of brilliance, ordered her to help care for the animals she had once despised. The day she arrived, dressed in an ill-fitting orange vest, she looked like she had been sentenced to a fate worse than death. I, leaning against a fence post with a grin, greeted her like an old friend. "Welcome to your new office, Margaret. Hope you're ready to get your hands dirty." She didn't respond. She just glared at me, gripping the edges of her vest like she wanted to rip it off. But she couldn't. The law had spoken. Her first task? Cleaning out the goat pen. I made sure to watch as she stepped inside, wrinkling her nose at the sight of hay and droppings scattered across the floor. The remaining goats bleated and trotted around her, completely unbothered by her presence. One particularly bold goat nibbled at her shoelaces. Margaret let out a frustrated groan, muttering under her breath as she grabbed a shovel. I couldn't resist. You know, Margaret, there's a lesson in all of this. She didn't look at me. Oh yeah? What's that? I smirked. You should have left my goats alone. She let out a deep sigh, her shoulders slumping in defeat. The once mighty ruler of the HOA, reduced to shoveling goat droppings on the very farm she had spent years trying to get rid of. It was perfect. The town moved on quickly. The goat festival became a huge success, drawing people from all over. My farm thrived, free from HOA interference. The neighborhood, no longer under Margaret's reign of terror, felt lighter. People started putting up decorations without fear. Kids rode bikes without getting fined. The town, once suffocated by her ridiculous rules, breathed again. Margaret, for all her bluster, eventually faded into the background. She completed her community service in bitter silence, then quietly sold her house and moved away. No one threw a going-away party. No one missed her. I, standing on my farm, watching my goats roam freely, couldn't help but marvel at how things had turned out. I had never planned to take down Margaret. I had just wanted to live in peace. But in the end, justice had a funny way of serving itself. And as I watched the newest batch of goats waddle across the field, I smiled. They were safe now. And Margaret? She would never mess with them again. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.